first of the two talks I'm going to do this morning is called simply Cold War Civil Rights. Now, the African American civil rights movement, as you know, experienced a major boost in 1954 when the Supreme Court unanimously declared that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. A year later, in Brown v. Board of Education 2, the court instructed Southern school systems to desegregate with all deliberate speed, a directive that, while it suggested urgency, did not in fact provide any clear timetable for implementing desegregation and did not require segregated school districts to immediately integrate. The court emphasized in Brown 2 that desegregation needed to be effected in an orderly manner and that the public interest of Southern communities needed to be balanced with the private interests of the plaintiffs in the case and other African American children and their parents seeking better educational facilities. Those parts of the story of the Brown decision, I think, are pretty well known already. Another part of the Brown decision that's also already quite ingrained in the national consciousness is that the unanimous opinion actually echoed rather closely the lone dissenting voice of Justice John Marshall Harlan, who came to be known as the Great Dissenter, in that famous 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case. In Plessy, the Supreme Court ruled that separate facilities in transportation and other areas of public life were perfectly constitutional so long as they were equal. Justice Harlan, himself the son of Kentucky slaveholders, would write memorably, "We shall enter upon an era of constitutional law when the rights of freedmen and American citizenship cannot receive from the nation that efficient protection which heretofore was unhesitatingly accorded to slavery and the rights of masters." Justice Harlan's dissent was not in all respects a model for progressive thinking about race. He did, for example, express the pervasive anti-Chinese racism of the time, arguing that it was not fair that African Americans should be excluded from public facilities that the Chinese had access to. Nonetheless, Harlan, 58 years before the Earl Warren Court, essentially argued that segregation was inherently unequal, and his dissent is rightly remembered as an important precursor to the Brown decision. But I'm still not telling you anything you don't already know. Not yet. The part of the Brown decision that for me is the most telling, the most memorable, and the most instructive was emphasized almost a decade ago by a scholar named Mary Dudziak in an article in the Journal of American History entitled simply Brown as a Cold War Case. What I offer here is a summary of her argument in that article and in her very important book, Cold War Civil Rights, Race and the Image of American Democracy. But I offer those summaries with an important caveat. The stories of African American civil rights in the Cold War had until quite recently been separate narratives. Scholars have traditionally treated McCarthyism, with its accompanying set of Supreme Court decisions in the early 1950s that restricted the rights of communists, and the Brown decision, which expanded civil rights, as if they existed in separate spheres. The famous Army McCarthy hearings, you may remember, took place from April to June 1954. The Brown case was decided on May 17th, 1954. But beyond the chronological connection, it's important to remember that the U.S. Justice Department filed amicus curiae, friend of the court briefs, in the cases leading up to Brown and in the Brown case itself, when the Justice Department stated the existence of discrimination against minority groups in the United States has an adverse effect upon our relations with other countries. Racial discrimination furnishes grist for the communist propaganda mills, and it raises doubts, even among friendly nations, as to the intensity of our devotion to the democratic faith. Secretary of State Dean Acheson was quoted in the Justice Department's amicus curiae brief in the Brown case. Acheson said, "Race discrimination remains a source of constant embarrassment to this government in the day-to-day conduct of its foreign relations, and it jeopardizes the effective maintenance of our moral leadership of the free and democratic nations of the world. American newspapers outside of the South responded to the Brown decision positively, emphasizing the strong message it would send to the nation's detractors in the Soviet Union, as well as to the colored peoples of Asia and Africa and South America, that the United States was dedicated to justice and democracy. And newspapers from Nigeria to New Delhi to Sydney hailed the Brown decision as proof of the United States' commitment to the democratic principles that dominated its rhetoric on the world stage. A writer in the Sydney Morning Herald, for example, wrote, "The US Supreme Court's decision should go a long way toward dissipating the validity of the communist contention that Western concepts of democracy are hypocritical." The Brown decision also gave the NAACP leverage. That organization's leaders emphasized that the world was watching the nation and responding positively to this important development. So, if the government wished to maintain that positive momentum on the world stage, it was incumbent upon it to further advance the cause of civil rights. Brown, in a sense, marked the end of the first stage of the civil rights movement, the legalist phase, which had been ongoing since the NAACP's founding in 1909-1910. But with Brown and Brown II, the activist phase of the movement began. The Supreme Court had instructed the South to desegregate with all deliberate speed, but the actual enforcement of Brown was not likely to be easy. The South was unlikely to respond positively to the court's directive. The speed of desegregation would be only so fast as the South allowed or the federal government insisted. The Soviet press generally ignored the Brown decision because that decision on the whole undercut Soviet claims of American hypocrisy. However, Izvestia reported that because the Brown opinion actually facilitated delays in the implementation of desegregation, the decision itself, Izvestia said, had clearly been rendered only for propaganda purposes. Now, when Mamie Till Bradley decided to display the brutally disfigured body of her murdered 14-year-old son, Emmett Till, in an open casket at his Chicago funeral in 1955, the world press reported on his abduction and killing in Mississippi and on the acquittal of his two killers by an all-white jury, instructed by the defense attorney to do their Anglo-Saxon duty. When the Eisenhower administration stepped into the fray in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957 to facilitate the desegregation of Central High School by the remarkably brave and resolute Little Rock Nine, the world was watching again, and the U.S. ended up looking good in the court of global opinion. Mary Dudziak does explain that the most pervasive response of the white South to the Brown decision was to set up a series of bureaucratic roadblocks to desegregation, a series of pupil placement laws that the Supreme Court actually upheld. And these laws stymied desegregation efforts and actually kept de facto segregation beneath the radar of international opinion. So the Cold War context helped the civil rights movement on one level, but on another level it hurt the movement, since the US government generally treated civil rights as a matter of secondary importance to the larger Cold War struggle, particularly in those instances when the world was not watching, such as was the case with the legal maneuvering against desegregation in the wake of the Brown decision. Still, the backdrop of the Cold War was always there, and civil rights activists learned to use it for the purpose of placing injustices in full global view. Those activists knew that the world was watching in the summer of 1961 when the Freedom Rides were launched, and the interracial group of riders were viciously beaten in southern bus terminals by mobs organized by Klan chapters. In one case, a bus was firebombed. FBI agents, by the way, were in attendance at the bus terminals and had advanced knowledge of the mobs, but offered no protection. Civil rights leaders knew the eyes of the world were focused on the United States when Bull Connor's Birmingham, Alabama police force attacked nonviolent civil rights demonstrators, including women and children, with dogs and clubs, and allowed high-pressure fire hoses to be turned on them. Later that year, when 4 girls were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, the global press focused its attentions once more on the gulf between democratic rhetoric and reality in the United States. This was the case again in the summer of 1964, Freedom Summer, when 3 civil rights activists were abducted and killed, and their bodies eventually found in Mississippi. And again, in 1965, when state troopers attacked nonviolent marchers on horseback with clubs and tear gas as they sought to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge into Montgomery, Alabama. At critical junctures in the civil rights movement, global attention to American injustice seems to have weighted the scales in favor of federal support for civil rights change. Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders and legions of grassroots activists are responsible for the successes of the civil rights movement, of course, but their successes came about in part because of their understanding of the significance of the Cold War context, and because of the federal government's understanding that it could not effectively wage the Cold War against the Soviet Union while ignoring systematic racism at home, especially not when it made headlines globally. So the caveat that I alluded to earlier. Back in 1896, Justice Harlan, I would suggest, not only laid the first foundations for the argument that segregation is inherently unequal, but he actually expressed, albeit indirectly, the U.S. Justice Department's and the Warren Court's 1954 concern that the eyes of the world were firmly fixed on the nation that claims so confidently to be the world's greatest democracy, and that American democracy would be judged not just by the rhetoric the nation offered to the world, but by the actual actions in America that the world would be watching. Harlan wrote in his Plessy v. Ferguson dissent, and I'll quote at length, "In view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. The law regards man as man and takes no account of his surroundings or of his color when his civil rights, as guaranteed by the Supreme law of the land, are involved. If evils will result from the commingling of the two races upon public highways established for the benefit of all, they will be infinitely less than those that would surely come from state legislation regulating the enjoyment of civil rights upon the basis of law." And now to the most pertinent part of the quotation. Harlan said, "We boast of the freedom enjoyed by our people above all other peoples. But it is difficult to reconcile that boast with a state of the law which practically puts the brand of servitude and degradation upon a large class of our fellow citizens, our equals before the law." Justice Harlan, like the Justice Department, when it lobbied the Warren Court 58 years later in Brown v. Board, understood that the gap between American democratic rhetoric and reality, vis-a-vis the denial of democratic rights to people of color, harmed the United States in the court of global opinion. The world was watching in 1954, just as it would be in 1955 and 1957 and 1961 and 63 and 64 and 65, and just as it had been back in 1896. In fact, the world had been watching quite keenly in 1893, just a few years before the Plessy v. Ferguson case was heard, when the brave and brilliant anti-lynching crusader Ida Wells toured Great Britain in an effort to highlight that gulf between democratic rhetoric and racial realities in the United States. Wells would collaborate with Frederick Douglass and others in 1893 on a booklet entitled "The Reason Why the Colored American is Not in the World's Columbian Exposition," and 20,000 copies of that publication were distributed free of charge from the Haitian Pavilion at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, and the Chicago World's Fair was visited by more than 30 million people from the United States and all across the globe. In 1894, Wells undertook a second tour of Great Britain, again with the purpose of directing world attention to the horrors taking place in the American South. Wells understood, like Justice Harlan around the same time, and like the U.S. Justice Department more than a half century later, and like the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson administrations during the height of the African-American civil rights movement from the mid-50s to the mid-60s, that the real merits of American democracy were measured not by American rhetoric, but by public perceptions on the global stage. Civil rights, like all other important American constitutional matters, are never really just American matters. They're always global issues. The eyes of the world are always watching, and Americans have been aware of this since the Revolution and the first construction of the Constitution. Thanks.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.